Take this rotten food away or you lose your job. We black people deserve respect.
You will not speak to my daughter that way. The words rang through the first-class cabin like a thunderclap. 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, time seemed to freeze. A small girl stood on her seat, her purple dress wrinkled from the flight, butterfly clips still perfectly placed in her hair. The flight attendant's face had gone from red with anger to pale with fear. Every passenger in that cabin had stopped what they were doing. Laptops closed. Headphones removed. Conversations died mid-sentence. And in that moment of absolute silence, this 6-year-old child would say something that would change everything. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back 3 hours. Back to before the confrontation. Before the viral video. Before the world knew the name Mimi Jacobs. Because this wasn't just about stale food on an airplane. This was about dignity. This was about respect. And this was about a 6-year-old who refused to be invisible. 3 hours earlier, LaGuardia Airport bustled with the usual chaos of international departures. Travelers rushed past each other, dragging suitcases, checking phones, calling out gate numbers to family members trailing behind. But in the Transatlantic Elite Airways VIP lounge, away from the chaos, things moved at a different pace. Mimi Jacobs sat curled up in an oversized leather chair, her legs tucked beneath her purple dress. The dress was her favorite, the one with the tiny embroidered flowers along the hem that caught the light when she moved. Her butterfly clips, one silver and one gold, held back her natural curls on each side. In her small hands she held a worn book about Amelia Earhart, the pages soft from repeated readings. "Mama, it says here that Amelia was scared sometimes but she flew anyway," Mimi said, her brown eyes lifting from the page to find her mother. Jayla Jacobs looked up from her phone, where she'd been reviewing travel documents. At 32, she carried herself with a quiet elegance that turned heads without demanding attention. Her tailored cream blazer and simple pearl earrings spoke of wealth, but it was the warmth in her eyes when she looked at her daughter that truly defined her. "That's what real bravery is, baby," Jayla said, setting her phone down and giving Mimi her full attention. "Being scared and doing the right thing anyway." Mimi considered this, her small finger marking her place in the book. Was she ever scared of people? Like, of what they might say to her? Jayla studied her daughter, recognizing the deeper question beneath the surface. Mimi had always been like this, curious, thoughtful, asking questions that cut straight to the heart of things. It was one of the things Jayla loved most about her, even when those questions were difficult to answer. "I think so," Jayla said carefully. "Back then, a lot of people didn't think women should be pilots. They probably said mean things to her. Tried to make her feel like she didn't belong in the sky. But she flew anyway." "But she flew anyway," Jayla repeated, smiling. "You know why?" Mimi shook her head, leaning forward. "Because she knew something important. Something I want you to always remember." Jayla reached out and gently adjusted one of Mimi's butterfly clips. "Remember, baby, your voice matters. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small." Mimi's eyes widened slightly. "Even if they're grown-ups? Especially then." Jayla's voice was firm but gentle. "Sometimes grown-ups forget that being older doesn't make them right. Sometimes grown-ups need to be reminded to do better." Mimi nodded solemnly, processing this information the way she processed everything, completely, thoroughly, storing it away for when she might need it. And she would need it. Sooner than either of them could have imagined. The overhead announcement crackled to life. "Transatlantic Elite Airways Flight 447 to Paris, Charles de Gaulle, now boarding first-class passengers through Gate 27. "That's us, baby girl," Jayla said, standing and smoothing her skirt. "Ready to go see Grandma?" Mimi's face lit up with pure joy. "Is she going to make her special chocolate cake?" "It's her birthday, so I think we're supposed to make her the cake," Jayla laughed, reaching for their carry-on bags. "But knowing your grandmother, she'll probably make one anyway." They made their way through the airport, Mimi's small hand clasped firmly in her mother's. The crowd parted naturally around them, though neither Jayla nor Mimi seemed to notice or care. They were in their own world, Mimi chattering excitedly about Paris, about the Eiffel Tower, about whether French butterflies looked different than American ones. Gate 27 was already busy with the boarding process, but the first-class line was mercifully short. The gate agent, a young man with kind eyes and a genuine smile, checked their boarding passes. "Mrs. Jacobs, Miss Jacobs, welcome aboard. You're in seats 2A and 2B today. Window seats, just as requested." "Did you hear that, Mimi? Window seats." Jayla's enthusiasm matched her daughter's. "Thank you," Mimi said brightly to the gate agent, and his smile grew even wider. Have a wonderful flight, young lady. The jetway stretched ahead of them, and Mimi practically vibrated with excitement. She'd flown before, many times actually, but the thrill never wore off. The idea that this massive metal tube would somehow lift them into the sky, carry them across an entire ocean, and set them down in a completely different country still felt like magic to her 6-year-old mind. The first-class cabin of Transatlantic Elite Airways Flight 447 was exactly what you'd expect from a premium international route. Wide leather seats that reclined into fully flat beds. Soft lighting that could be adjusted to individual preference. Small touches of luxury everywhere you looked. Real wood accents, fresh flowers and crystal vases secured to surfaces, plush blankets already folded neatly on each seat. A flight attendant greeted them at the entrance, her smile professional but warm. "Welcome aboard. Let me help you find your seats." She guided them to row 2, helping Mimi stow her small backpack in the overhead compartment while Jayla settled their other items. "The window seat is all yours, sweetheart," the flight attendant said to Mimi. "We'll be taking off in about 20 minutes. Can I get you anything to drink while we wait?" "Apple juice, please," Mimi said, already climbing into her seat and pressing her face against the window. "And for you, ma'am?" "Sparkling water would be lovely, thank you," Jayla replied. As the flight attendant moved away to fulfill their requests, Mimi took in her surroundings with wide eyes. The cabin was filling up around them. Across the aisle and one row back, a businessman in an expensive suit was already setting up his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard even before takeoff. 2 rows behind them, an elderly couple was settling in, the husband carefully helping his wife with her seatbelt, their movements speaking of decades of practiced care for each other. Near the front, a young woman in her 20s had immediately put in noise-canceling headphones and closed her eyes. "Mama, look," Mimi whispered, pointing out the window as a baggage cart rolled by below. "They're loading our suitcases." Jayla leaned over to look, breathing in the scent of her daughter's hair, coconut oil and the strawberry shampoo she'd insisted on that morning. "I hope they're careful with Grandma's present. The music box is wrapped really good, remember? With all that bubble stuff." "Bubble wrap, baby." "Bubble wrap," Mimi repeated, filing away the correct term. She was always doing that, Jayla noticed. Collecting words, storing them, using them correctly the next time. Her kindergarten teacher had called her a sponge, absorbing everything around her. The flight attendant returned with their drinks, complete with little cocktail napkins and, to Mimi's delight, a small package of cookies shaped like airplanes. "These are for you," the attendant said, placing them on Mimi's tray table with a wink. "Don't tell the other passengers. We saved the special cookies for our VIP travelers." Mimi beamed, carefully opening the package. "Thank you so much." Everything felt perfect. Everything felt right. The cabin hummed with the quiet efficiency of a well-run operation. Passengers settled into their seats, stowing bags, adjusting air vents, scrolling through the entertainment system to plan their viewing for the long flight ahead. The atmosphere was one of calm anticipation, the particular feeling that comes at the start of a journey, when everything still feels full of possibility. Jayla helped Mimi fasten her seatbelt, making sure it was snug but not too tight. "Comfortable?" "Ahow," Mimi nodded, already turning back to the window to watch the ground crew at work. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and confident. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez speaking. Welcome aboard Transatlantic Elite Airways Flight 447, with non-stop service to Paris, Charles de Gaulle. We're looking at a flight time of approximately 7 hours and 15 minutes today. Weather in Paris is beautiful, sunny and 72 degrees. We'll be pushing back from the gate in just a few minutes here. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for departure." Mimi pressed her nose against the window, not wanting to miss a single moment. She watched as the jetway pulled away, as the tug vehicle attached itself to the nose of the plane, as the ground crew gave their final signals. The engines rumbled to life, a deep thrumming that Mimi could feel in her chest. "Here we go," Jayla murmured, reaching over to squeeze her daughter's hand. And they were moving. Slowly at first, backing away from the gate, then turning toward the taxiway. The world outside the window began to slide past. Other planes, service vehicles, the terminal building growing smaller behind them. Everything was perfect. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it should be. But in just a few hours, everything would change. Because sometimes the worst moments come when you're least expecting them. Sometimes cruelty arrives wearing a smile. And sometimes, it takes a 6-year-old child to show an entire cabin full of adults what courage really looks like. If you want to see how this incredible story unfolds, How one little girl's voice changed everything. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel because what happens next will absolutely shock you. But first, I want to ask you something. Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly? Have you ever seen discrimination happening right in front of you? What did you do? Drop your answer in the comments below because after you hear what happened on Flight 447, you might think differently about speaking up. The plane taxied toward the runway and Mimi Jacobs, still pressed against that window, still clutching her mother's hand, had no idea that she was about to become the youngest civil rights hero of 2024. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. All around the first-class cabin, passengers began to relax into their journeys. The businessman across the aisle closed one spreadsheet and opened another. The elderly couple a few rows back had already dozed off, their heads tilted toward each other in that comfortable way that only comes from years of shared travel. The young woman with the headphones was absorbed in whatever movie she'd selected, occasionally laughing quietly to herself. Mimi had finally pulled herself away from the window, satisfied that she'd seen all there was to see of the clouds below. She'd retrieved her Amelia Earhart book from her backpack and was reading quietly, occasionally sharing interesting facts with her mother. "Mama, did you know that Amelia Earhart set a record for flying 14,000 feet high? That's almost 3 miles up in the sky." Jayla smiled, looking up from her own book. "That's incredible, baby. Although I think we're flying even higher than that right now." "Really?" Mimi's eyes went wide. "We're breaking Amelia's record?" "Well, modern planes fly a bit differently, but yes, we're probably at about 35,000 feet right now." Mimi tried to wrap her mind around that number, staring out the window at the clouds that looked so close you could touch them. Everything felt peaceful. Safe. The gentle hum of the engines, the comfortable temperature of the cabin, the soft lighting overhead, it all contributed to a sense of serene normalcy. But that was about to change. The first sign came when a new flight attendant emerged from the galley at the front of the cabin. She was different from the woman who had greeted them during boarding. This one was older, perhaps in her late 40s, with her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes. She wore the same crisp transatlantic Elite Airways uniform as the other attendants, but somehow it looked different on her. Harder. More severe. Her name tag read Vicker. She moved through the cabin with mechanical efficiency, checking overhead bins, adjusting window shades that didn't need adjusting, her movements precise but cold. When she smiled at passengers, it never quite reached her eyes. It was the kind of smile you give because the employee handbook says you should, not because you mean it. Vicker made her way down the aisle, greeting passengers as she went. "Good afternoon, sir. Is everything comfortable for you?" To the businessman. "Ma'am, can I adjust your pillow for you?" To another passenger. "Let me know if you need anything at all," to a couple near the front. Her voice was professional. Pleasant even. But then she reached row 2. And something changed. It was subtle. So subtle that if you weren't paying attention, you might have missed it entirely. But Mimi was 6 years old and 6-year-olds notice everything. They haven't yet learned to ignore the small signals that adults have trained themselves not to see. They haven't yet been taught that sometimes it's easier to pretend you didn't notice the shift in someone's expression, the change in their tone, the way their whole energy transforms in an instant. Vicker's eyes landed on Jayla and Mimi, and something flickered across her face. The professional smile remained fixed in place, but it became tighter. Thinner. Her eyes, which had been making genuine contact with other passengers, now seemed to look through them rather than at them. When she spoke, her voice lost its warmth, becoming clipped and formal. "Good afternoon," she said, but the words came out flat, mechanical, as if she were reading from a script she didn't particularly care about. Something in the woman's eyes made Mimi's stomach feel funny. Not the kind of funny that comes before you throw up, but the kind of funny that comes when you know something is wrong but you don't quite understand what. It was the same feeling she got when she walked into a room and everyone suddenly stopped talking. The same feeling she got when she was the only one not invited to a birthday party, even though the invitation said, "Whole class invited." Mimi looked up at her mother, trying to read her expression. Jayla's face remained calm, but Mimi noticed her mother's jaw tighten slightly. Just the tiniest bit. That was another thing about being 6. You knew your mother's face better than anyone else in the world. You could read the microscopic changes that signaled her moods. "Good afternoon," Jayla replied, her voice warm despite the coolness she was receiving. "Everything's wonderful so far, thank you." Vicker's eyes dropped to their seats, then swept across to the empty seat beside Mimi where their bags were stored under the seat in front. Her tight smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. "Are you sure you're in the right seats?" she asked. The question hung in the air like smoke. Jayla blinked, clearly taken aback. I'm sorry? Your seats. Are you certain these are your assigned seats? Vicker's tone suggested she was being helpful, clarifying a simple mistake, but something underneath the words felt sharp. Pointed. Yes, we're in 2A and 2B, Jayla said slowly, her voice remaining even. Our boarding passes. May I see them? It wasn't really a question. Jayla reached into the seat pocket in front of her where she'd tucked their boarding passes after boarding. Mimi watched as her mother pulled them out and handed them to Vicker. The flight attendant took them, holding them up to examine them closely. Too closely. She tilted them toward the light. Studied them from different angles. Read every line of text as if searching for evidence of forgery. Mimi's confusion was building into something else now. Something that felt like embarrassment, though she didn't quite know why. She hadn't done anything wrong. Neither had her mother. So why did this feel like they were in trouble? She glanced around the cabin, and that's when she noticed something that made her stomach feel even funnier. The businessman across the aisle was already in his seat, and no one had asked to see his boarding pass. The elderly couple behind them had been sleeping for 20 minutes, and no one had woken them up to verify their seats. The young woman with headphones had never been questioned at all. Only them. Only Mimi and her mother. Vicker finally handed the boarding passes back to Jayla, the tight smile still frozen on her face. Everything appears to be in order. The way she said appears made it sound like she still had her doubts. Of course it is, Jayla said, and though her voice remained calm, Mimi heard something new underneath it. Something that sounded like controlled anger. We checked in properly and boarded properly just like everyone else. Vicker didn't respond to that. She simply gave a curt nod and moved on, but not before Mimi saw something flash in her eyes again. Something cold and hard. Mimi looked up at her mother. Mama, why did she? Not right now, baby, Jayla said softly, but her hand found Mimi's and squeezed gently. That squeeze said everything that couldn't be said out loud in that moment. It said I saw it too. It said you're not imagining things. It said I'm here with you. The incident passed and the cabin returned to its peaceful state. Or at least it appeared to. But something had shifted. The sense of safety and comfort that Mimi had felt earlier was now tinged with something else. Wariness. Uncertainty. She tried to return to her book, but the words blurred on the page. She found herself watching Vicker instead, tracking her movements through the cabin. The flight attendant was preparing for the meal service now, working with another attendant to organize the carts in the galley. 30 minutes passed. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, providing an update on their progress, the weather ahead, the smooth flight conditions. Everything sounded normal. Everything sounded fine. But Mimi's stomach still felt funny. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be coming through the cabin shortly with our lunch service, Vicker's voice announced over the PA system. For those of you in first class, today we're pleased to offer a choice of grilled salmon with roasted vegetables and lemon butter sauce, or herb-crusted chicken with wild rice pilaf. We also have a vegetarian pasta option available upon request. Mimi perked up at this. The food on planes was always such an adventure. Sometimes it was amazing, sometimes it was strange, but it was always interesting. And she was getting hungry. The meal service began at the front of the cabin. Vicker and another flight attendant worked in tandem, one pushing the cart while the other served. Mimi watched as they made their way down the aisle, row by row, passenger by passenger. The businessman was first. Vicker's entire demeanor transformed when she addressed him. Her smile became genuine, her voice warm and attentive. Good afternoon, sir. For your lunch today, we have grilled salmon with roasted vegetables and lemon butter sauce, or herb-crusted chicken with wild rice pilaf. Which would you prefer? The salmon sounds excellent, the businessman said without looking up from his laptop. Wonderful choice, sir. Here's your grilled salmon with roasted vegetables. The lemon butter sauce is in the small container on the side. Can I get you anything else? Perhaps some fresh ground pepper? Another beverage? I'm fine, thank you. Of course. Enjoy your meal, sir. The care with which Vicker set up his meal was impressive. She arranged everything on his tray table just so. The main course in the center, the side salad positioned perfectly to the left, the warm bread roll with butter to the right. She even adjusted the placement of his utensils, making sure they were aligned properly. They moved to the next row, where a middle-aged woman sat reading a magazine. And for you, ma'am? Salmon or chicken today? Oh, the chicken sounds lovely. Excellent. Here you are, herb-crusted chicken with wild rice pilaf. I've included our seasonal vegetable medley as well. Can I bring you anything else? More wine, perhaps? The interaction was pleasant, professional, caring. Vicker took her time, made sure everything was perfect, asked follow-up questions to ensure satisfaction. Then they reached the elderly couple. The woman had woken up, and both she and her husband were looking forward to their meal. "Well, hello there." Vicker's voice actually sounded cheerful now. "What can I get for you two today? We have salmon or chicken." "Oh, the salmon for me, please," the elderly woman said. "And I'll have the chicken," her husband added. "Perfect. Let me set these up for you." Vicker took extra care with them, making sure the older woman could reach everything easily, helping adjust the husband's tray table when it stuck slightly. "There you go. You two enjoy and let me know if you need anything at all." "Thank you, dear. You're so sweet," the elderly woman said. Mimi watched all of this, observing the pattern. Each passenger received careful attention. Warm tones. Genuine smiles. Questions about preferences and needs. The food was presented beautifully, steaming and fresh, arranged with obvious care. The cart moved closer to row 2. Mimi felt her mother shift slightly in her seat. That imperceptible tensing that comes from anticipating something unpleasant. Had Jayla noticed the same pattern Mimi had? Did she know that something was different about how Vicker treated certain passengers? They reached the row directly in front of Mimi and Jayla. Another couple, younger this time, probably in their 30s. "Good afternoon. What can I get for you both today?" The warmth was still there. The genuine interest. The careful presentation. And then the cart stopped at row 2. Vicker turned to face them, and that transformation happened again. The smile tightened. The eyes went cold. The voice lost its musicality and became flat, mechanical. "Lunch," she said. Not a question. Not an offer. Just a statement. Before Jayla could even respond, before she could express a preference between salmon or chicken, Vicker reached into a lower compartment of the cart. Not the upper section where the beautiful hot meals were kept. The lower section. The area that had remained closed during every other service interaction. She pulled out 2 pre-made wrapped sandwiches and 2 small plastic containers of fruit. She placed them on Mimi and Jayla's tray tables without ceremony, without care, without the careful arrangement she'd shown every other passenger. The difference was stark. While other passengers had received hot meals on real plates with metal utensils and cloth napkins, Mimi and Jayla had been given cold sandwiches in plastic wrap with plastic forks and paper napkins. "Juice or water?" Vicker stated. Again, not a question. She was already pulling out 2 small juice boxes from the cart. "Actually," Jayla said, her voice tight, "we were told there was a choice of salmon or—" "This is what we have for this section," Vicker interrupted, setting the juice boxes down with just enough force that they made a small thud against the tray tables. "Will there be anything else?" The phrase "this section" hung in the air. This section. As if row 2 was somehow different from rows 1, 3, 4 and every other row in first class that had received the hot meal service. Jayla stared at the flight attendant, clearly trying to process what was happening, trying to decide how to respond. Mimi watched her mother's face, saw the calculations happening behind her eyes. Was this worth making a scene over? Was this really what it seemed to be? Or was there some logical explanation? "No," Jayla finally said, her voice carefully controlled. "That will be all." Vicker moved on without another word, and the warmth returned to her voice as she greeted the passengers in row 3. "Good afternoon. Let me tell you about today's lunch options." Mimi stared down at the food in front of her. The sandwich was wrapped in clear plastic, the kind you might find in a convenience store cooler. Through the plastic, she could see that the bread looked dry, its edges slightly curled. The lettuce inside had that wilted look that vegetables get when they've been sitting too long. There was supposed to be turkey, she thought, but it was hard to tell through the plastic. The fruit cup was even worse. She could see it clearly through the plastic container. Apple slices that had turned brown from oxidation, berries that looked mushy and overripe, a couple of grapes that might have been okay a few days ago. The juice box was room temperature, possibly warmer, and when Mimi picked it up to examine it, she noticed the expiration date was coming up soon. Very soon. Her excitement about the meal, about this whole adventure, deflated like a balloon with a slow leak. She looked over at her mother's meal. Identical to hers. The same dry sandwich. The same brown fruit. The same warm juice. Then she looked across the aisle at the businessman's tray. His salmon glistened with butter sauce. Steam still rose from his roasted vegetables. His bread roll sat in a small basket, wrapped in cloth to keep it warm. Even his salad looked fresh and crisp, with real dressing in a glass container on the side. Behind them, she could hear the elderly couple commenting on how delicious their meals were, how the chicken was cooked perfectly, How nice it was to have such a good meal on an airplane. Mimi's 6-year-old brain tried to make sense of what had just happened. She replayed the interactions she'd witnessed, comparing them to what she and her mother had experienced. The warmth versus the coldness. The questions versus the statements. The beautiful presentation versus the careless dumping of prepackaged food. The hot meals versus the cold sandwiches. She looked at the other passengers in first class again. Really looked at them this time. The businessman was white. The elderly couple was white. The younger couple in front of them was white. The middle-aged woman with the magazine was white. Everyone who had received the hot meal was white. She and her mother, the only black passengers in first class, had received something completely different. Mimi's stomach didn't just feel funny anymore. It felt wrong. Heavy. Like she'd swallowed something that didn't agree with her, even though she hadn't eaten anything yet. "Mama," she whispered, her voice small and confused. "Why is our food different?" Jayla didn't answer right away. When Mimi looked up at her, she saw that her mother's jaw was clenched tight, her eyes fixed straight ahead. But then Jayla seemed to make a conscious effort to soften her expression. She looked down at Mimi and managed a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I don't know, baby," she said quietly. "But we're going to figure it out." Mimi unwrapped her sandwich slowly, the plastic crinkling loudly in the quiet cabin. Other passengers were already eating, making sounds of satisfaction, having quiet conversations about their meals. But Mimi just stared at what was in front of her. The bread was definitely stale. She could tell just by looking at it. The edges were hard and had started to crack. When she picked up half of the sandwich, the bread felt tough under her fingers, nothing like the soft, fresh bread she could see in the basket on the businessman's tray. She took a small bite, more out of hunger than actual desire to eat. The bread was dry and difficult to chew. The turkey tasted old, that particular flavor that meat gets when it's been sitting out just a little too long. The lettuce was indeed wilted, adding nothing but a sad, soggy texture. Mimi set the sandwich back down and opened the fruit cup instead. Maybe that would be better. It wasn't. The apple slices were completely brown, soft and mealy when she tried one. The berries fell apart when she touched them with her plastic fork. The grapes were wrinkled at the edges, beginning to turn. This wasn't just food that wasn't as nice as what the other passengers got. This was food that someone should have thrown away. This was food that didn't belong on a plane, that didn't belong being served to anyone, let alone a 6-year-old child on a 7-hour flight. Mimi's eyes started to sting, that particular burning sensation that comes right before tears. But she blinked hard, forcing them back. She didn't want to cry. Crying felt like giving up, like admitting defeat, and she hadn't done anything wrong. Why should she cry? She looked at the juice box, her last hope for something edible. She stuck the small straw through the hole and took a sip. It was warm. Not just room temperature but actually warm, like it had been sitting in the sun. The apple juice tasted off, slightly fermented, the way juice gets when it's about to go bad. Mimi set it down carefully and looked up at her mother. Jayla had opened her own meal and come to the same conclusions. She hadn't eaten more than a bite of anything. Now she was staring at the food on her tray table with an expression that Mimi had never seen on her mother's face before. It was anger, yes, but more than that. It was hurt, disappointment, disgust, and something else that Mimi was too young to name but could recognize instinctively. It was the look of someone realizing that they and their child had been intentionally disrespected. Around them, the meal service continued. Vicker was at the back of the cabin now, her voice floating forward with that same warmth she'd shown to every other passenger. "How is everything tasting? Can I get you anything else? More beverages? Dessert will be coming around shortly. We have a lovely chocolate mousse cake today." But when she passed by row 2 on her way back to the galley, she didn't ask how their meal was. Didn't offer more beverages. Didn't mention dessert. She simply walked by without making eye contact, as if they weren't even there. And here's what I want to ask you watching this right now. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew you were being treated unfairly, but everyone around you was acting like everything was normal? Have you ever felt invisible while simultaneously being singled out? Drop your answer in the comments, because what happens next will show you exactly what speaking up looks like, and why it matters. If you're invested in this story, if you want to see how little Mimi Jacobs handles this situation, hit that subscribe button right now, because what she does next is something every single person needs to witness. Mimi sat there, staring at the inedible food in front of her, feeling that wrongness in her stomach grow heavier and heavier. The plane hummed around her, carrying them higher and farther from home, and for the first time in her 6 years, Mimi Jacobs truly understood what her mother had been trying to teach her. Sometimes grown-ups don't do better on their own. Sometimes they need to be reminded. Sometimes they need to be called out. And sometimes it takes a 6-year-old to show them how. Mimi stared at the brown apples in front of her, at the hard bread that she could barely chew, at the warm juice that tasted like it had gone bad. She looked at her mother, who was sitting perfectly still, that controlled anger radiating off her in waves that Mimi could feel even without understanding exactly what they meant. And then Mimi made a decision. She turned in her seat, looking back toward where Vicker had gone. The flight attendant was near the galley now, laughing with another crew member about something, her whole body language relaxed and easy. The same woman who had been so cold and clipped with them was now animated and warm with her colleague. Mimi raised her small hand, the way she'd been taught in school when she wanted to ask a question. When Vicker didn't notice, she raised it higher. And then, in a voice that was polite but clear, loud enough to be heard but not shouting, she called out, "Excuse me, miss?" Vicker turned, and that tight smile snapped back into place like a mask. She walked back toward row 2, her movements slower now, more deliberate, as if she were doing them a favor by responding at all. "Yes." The word came out flat, barely a question. Mimi swallowed hard. Her heart was beating fast in her chest, that nervous feeling you get when you're about to do something brave but scary. She could feel her mother's attention on her, could sense Jayla about to speak, but Mimi had already committed. She had already decided that she was going to use her voice. "I think this food might be old," Mimi said, and her voice was so polite, so careful, so respectful. She wasn't being rude. She wasn't being demanding. She was simply stating a fact, the way she might tell a teacher that she needed a new pencil because hers had broken. The change in Vicker was immediate and shocking. Her expression hardened, her eyes narrowing. When she spoke, her voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet hum of the cabin like a knife. "It's perfectly fine. That's what we have for children." The dismissiveness in her tone was unmistakable. She wasn't just disagreeing with Mimi. She was shutting her down, treating her concern as if it were a complaint from a spoiled child who didn't know any better. But Mimi did know better. She knew what fresh food looked like. She knew what food that had gone bad looked like. And she wasn't going to pretend she didn't. "But the bread is hard and the apples are brown," Mimi said, her voice still polite but firmer now. She picked up one of the apple slices to show Vicker, the brown, mushy piece of fruit sitting sadly on her plastic fork. And that's when Vicker's voice got louder. Loud enough that other passengers were definitely going to hear. Loud enough that there was no mistaking the aggression in it. "Are you calling me a liar, little girl?" The words hung in the air like a slap. The emphasis on "little girl" carried so much contempt, so much condescension, that it made Mimi physically recoil. She wasn't just being dismissed anymore. She was being attacked for having the audacity to speak up about receiving inedible food. Mimi opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She was 6 years old, and a grown woman was towering over her, accusing her of calling her a liar, using a tone that made it clear she was the problem here, not the spoiled food. That's when Jayla stepped in. "Excuse me." Jayla's voice cut through the tension like a bell, clear and controlled, but with an undercurrent of steel that hadn't been there before. She leaned forward slightly, positioning herself between Vicker and her daughter, a mother's instinct to protect kicking in automatically. Vicker turned her attention to Jayla, and if her expression had been cold before, it was glacial now. "There's clearly an issue with the meal," Jayla said, and her tone was still calm, still reasonable but firm. She was giving Vicker a chance to make this right, to fix the mistake, to do her job properly. "Could we get a fresh one, please?" It was such a simple request. Such a reasonable request. Any other passenger could have made it, and it would have been handled immediately with apologies and accommodation. But Vicker didn't move to get them a fresh meal. She didn't apologize. She didn't even acknowledge that there might be a problem. Instead, she crossed her arms over her chest and said, in a voice dripping with barely concealed hostility, "This is what's available in your section." That pause before section was deliberate. Loaded. It hung there in the space between them, heavy with implication. Your section. Not first class. Not the section where everyone else was sitting and eating hot, fresh meals. Your section. The section where people like you belong. The section where you get whatever we decide to give you and you don't complain about it. Jayla's expression didn't change, but Mimi saw her mother's hands grip the armrests of her seat, knuckles going slightly pale from the pressure. "We're in first class," Jayla said slowly, enunciating each word with careful precision. "Same as everyone else here." She gestured subtly toward the other passengers, toward the businessman still enjoying his salmon, toward the elderly couple finishing their chicken, toward every other person in that cabin who had received the meal service that Jayla and Mimi had been denied. Vicker followed Jayla's gesture with her eyes, and when she looked back, there was something almost triumphant in her expression. As if she were enjoying this. As if she had been waiting for this confrontation and was relishing it now that it had arrived. "Are we really going to make a scene over a sandwich?" she asked, and her voice had taken on a mocking quality now, as if the very idea that they would dare to complain was absurd and entitled. Make a scene. As if they were the ones creating the problem. As if they were the ones being unreasonable. As if asking for edible food on a premium international flight was somehow an outrageous demand. The thing about microaggressions, about discrimination that hides behind plausible deniability, is that it puts the victim in an impossible position. Speak up and you're making a scene. You're being difficult. You're playing the race card. Stay silent, and you accept the mistreatment, you swallow the disrespect, you teach your child that their voice doesn't matter. Jayla was trapped in that impossible space and she knew it. Mimi could see it on her mother's face, the calculations happening at lightning speed. How far to push this? Whether it was worth escalating. What the consequences might be. But before Jayla could respond, before she could navigate that impossible choice, something else happened. Other passengers were starting to notice. The businessman across the aisle had stopped typing on his laptop. He was looking over now, his expression confused, clearly hearing the exchange and trying to understand what was happening. Behind them, the elderly woman was whispering to her husband, her voice low but audible in the now quiet cabin. "What's going on up there? Why is she speaking to them like that?" The young woman with the headphones had pulled them down around her neck, her attention fully on the confrontation unfolding in row 2. Vicker seemed to realize that she had an audience now, and something shifted in her demeanor. She was still hostile, still dismissive, but she became more calculated about it. She leaned in closer to Jayla and Mimi, lowering her voice so that what she said next would be heard primarily by them, though it was still loud enough that those nearby could catch it. "Maybe you should have packed something from home if you're so particular." The words were delivered with a smile that wasn't a smile at all. They were meant to sound like helpful advice, like a reasonable suggestion, but the subtext was clear as day. People like you should know better than to expect the same service as everyone else. People like you should come prepared because you can't count on being treated equally. And then, even quieter but still audible to everyone in the immediate vicinity, Vicker added, "Some people just don't belong in first class." The statement hung in the air like poison gas, spreading through the cabin, impossible to ignore or unsee. She had said it. She had actually said it out loud. All the subtext, all the implications, all the coded language and loaded pauses, she had finally dropped the pretense and said exactly what she meant. Some people just don't belong in first class. And everyone within hearing distance knew exactly which some people she was talking about. The businessman's eyes went wide. The elderly woman gasped audibly. Even the young woman with the headphones looked shocked, her hand coming up to cover her mouth. Mimi felt something break inside her chest. Not break as in shatter into pieces, but break as in crack open, releasing something that had been building up since Vicker first questioned their boarding passes, since she first treated them with that cold dismissiveness, since she first served them inedible food while giving everyone else hot, fresh meals. Her eyes started to well up with tears. She was 6 years old, and a grown woman had just told her, in front of a cabin full of strangers, that she didn't belong, that she wasn't good enough, that the color of her skin meant she deserved less. But even as the tears gathered in her eyes, even as that hot, horrible feeling rose in her throat, Mimi didn't cry. She wouldn't cry. She blinked hard, forcing the tears back, refusing to give Vicker the satisfaction of seeing her break down. Instead, she looked at her mother. Jayla's face had gone through a transformation. The careful control, the measured responses, the attempts at de-escalation, all of that was gone now. Her expression was one of pure, righteous fury. Her jaw was clenched so tight that Mimi could see the muscles working. Her eyes had gone hard as diamonds. Her whole body was coiled like a spring, ready to unleash years of accumulated anger at every microaggression, every dismissive comment, every time someone had made her feel like she didn't belong somewhere she had every right to be. She was about to destroy Vicker with words. Mimi could see it coming, could see her mother drawing in that breath, preparing to unleash a verbal assault that would leave the flight attendant in tears, that would have every passenger in that cabin on their side, that would probably result in the captain being called and Vicker being removed from service. And Mimi knew her mother had every right to do it. Every justification. Every reason to tear into this woman who had disrespected them, who had served them spoiled food, who had told them they didn't belong. But in that moment, looking at her mother's face, something clicked in Mimi's 6-year-old brain. She remembered the conversation in the airport lounge. Her mother's words, spoken just a few hours ago, though it felt like a lifetime. Your voice matters. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small. Even if they're grown-ups? Especially then. And she remembered the book she'd been reading. Amelia Earhart. The woman who flew when everyone said she shouldn't. The woman who was scared but did it anyway. The woman who proved she belonged in the sky, not by yelling at the people who said she didn't, but by showing them through her actions. Mimi made a decision in that moment. A decision that would change everything that came after. A decision that a 6-year-old shouldn't have had to make but that she made anyway because sometimes children are braver than adults, sometimes they see more clearly, sometimes they know instinctively what needs to be done. As her mother opened her mouth to speak, as Jayla prepared to defend them both with all the fury of a protective parent who had been pushed too far, Mimi did something unexpected. She stood up on her seat. Not aggressively. Not violently. She simply stood up, her small frame now elevated above the seat backs, visible to everyone in the first-class cabin. Her purple dress with the embroidered flowers caught the cabin lights. Her butterfly clips, one silver, one gold, glinted as she turned her head to look around at all the passengers who were now staring at her. "Mimi baby, what are you?" Jayla started to say, her fury momentarily interrupted by confusion. But Mimi wasn't looking at her mother anymore. She wasn't looking at Vicker either, though she could see the flight attendant's face had gone pale, then red, then pale again as she realized she had lost control of the situation entirely. Mimi was looking at everyone else. At the businessman. At the elderly couple. At the young woman with the headphones. At every passenger in that cabin who had witnessed what just happened, who had heard what Vicker said, who had seen the difference in treatment with their own eyes. And in a voice that was clear and steady, without anger or tears, with nothing but honest truth, Mimi Jacobs prepared to speak. "Before we hear what this 6-year-old says next, words that will be watched by millions of people around the world, I need to ask you something. When you see injustice happening, do you speak up? Do you use your voice? Or do you stay silent and hope someone else will handle it? Because what Mimi does in the next few minutes will challenge everything you think you know about courage, about dignity, and about the power of simply telling the truth. If you want to hear this little girl's speech that left an entire airplane cabin in stunned silence, that went viral within hours, that sparked a national conversation about discrimination, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens next is the reason this story needs to be heard by everyone." Mimi stood on that seat, 35,000 feet in the air, with nothing but her truth and her courage, about to show every adult in that cabin what it really means to stand up for yourself. And nothing would ever be the same again. Mimi stood on her seat, her small hands gripping the headrest in front of her for balance. The cabin lights cast a soft glow on her purple dress, and for a moment she looked almost ethereal standing there, this tiny child elevated above the rows of expensive leather seats, visible to everyone, impossible to ignore. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, that thundering beat that comes when you're about to do something terrifying and necessary. Her legs felt shaky beneath her, and part of her wanted to sit back down, to let her mother handle this, to be invisible again. But she didn't sit down. Instead, she took a deep breath, the way her mother had taught her to do before a school presentation or when she felt nervous about something important. She squared her small shoulders. And then, in a voice that was surprisingly clear and steady for a 6-year-old who was absolutely terrified, she spoke. "Excuse me, everyone. I have something to say." The effect was immediate and total. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The quiet ambient noise of the cabin, the rustle of magazines, the tapping of keyboards, the murmur of small talk, all of it ceased instantly. It was as if someone had pressed a pause button on the entire first-class section. Every head turned toward row 2. Every pair of eyes found this small child standing on her seat, her butterfly clips catching the light, her expression serious and determined. Vicker's face went from pale to bright red in an instant. She lunged forward slightly, her voice sharp and commanding, the voice of an authority figure used to being obeyed without question. "Sit down right now." But Mimi didn't sit down. She didn't even look at Vicker. She kept her eyes on the other passengers, on the people who had witnessed what happened, on the audience she needed to reach. And she continued speaking, her voice cutting through Vicker's command as if it hadn't been spoken at all. "My name is Mimi Jacobs. I'm 6 years old." She paused, letting that sink in. 6 years old. A child. Someone who should be protected and cared for, not mistreated and dismissed. And I was just given old food because of how I look. The words fell into the cabin like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward, touching every person within hearing distance. The statement was so simple, so direct, so devastatingly clear that there was no way to misunderstand it or dismiss it. Because of how I look. She hadn't said, because I'm black. She hadn't used clinical terms like racial discrimination or prejudice. She had simply stated the truth in the language of a 6-year-old child who was trying to understand why a grown-up would treat her differently than everyone else. Mimi's voice didn't waver. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shouting. She was simply stating facts, the way she might describe what she did at school that day or what she had for breakfast that morning. But those facts, delivered with such innocent honesty, hit harder than any angry accusation ever could. That lady gave everyone else hot food with vegetables and asked if they needed anything. As she spoke, Mimi gestured toward the other passengers, toward their trays with the remnants of salmon and chicken, the empty plates that had held fresh, hot meals. Several passengers looked down at their own food, suddenly seeing it in a new context, understanding what it represented. She gave me old bread and brown fruit and told me it was fine. Mimi reached down and picked up the plastic-wrapped sandwich from her tray table, holding it up so everyone could see. The dried-out bread with its curled edges was visible even from rows away. She set it down and picked up the fruit cup, the brown apple slices and mushy berries clearly past their prime, clearly not something anyone should be serving to a child or anyone else. My mom taught me to always speak up when something's wrong. At this, Mimi finally glanced at her mother. Jayla was staring up at her daughter with an expression that mixed pride, heartbreak, and awe in equal measures. Tears were streaming down her face now, but she made no move to stop Mimi. She understood in that moment that this was her daughter's moment, that this was the lesson she had been teaching Mimi finally being put into practice in the most public and profound way possible. She taught me that my voice matters. The cabin was so quiet now that you could hear the engines humming, the air circulation system whooshing softly through the vents. 30-some adults sat in absolute silence, transfixed by this small child who was teaching them something they should have already known. The businessman across the aisle had completely forgotten about his laptop. His expensive meal sat half-eaten on his tray table, suddenly seeming less appetizing as he realized what had been happening in the row across from him while he'd been absorbed in his work. The elderly couple behind them, the ones who had commented on how delicious their chicken was, were now looking at each other with expressions of horror and shame. They had been eating that wonderful meal while a child 2 rows ahead of them had been served garbage and told it was fine. The young woman with the headphones had pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking slightly as she opened her camera app, pointing it toward Mimi. This needed to be documented. This needed to be seen. This needed to be shared with people who weren't on this plane but who needed to understand that these things still happened, that discrimination wasn't some relic of the past but a living, breathing reality that a 6-year-old child was currently experiencing. Vicker was frozen in place, her face cycling through expressions: anger, fear, disbelief, panic. She opened her mouth to speak, to regain control of the situation, but no words came out. What could she possibly say? How could she defend herself against the simple, honest truth being spoken by a child? And Mimi wasn't finished. I don't understand why someone would treat a child badly. Her voice carried genuine confusion, the bewilderment of a 6-year-old trying to make sense of something that made no sense. She wasn't accusing. She wasn't condemning. She was simply expressing her inability to comprehend how an adult could look at a child, any child, and decide they deserved less, deserved worse, deserved to be made to feel small. I don't understand why my skin color means I get different food. She said it so plainly, without self-pity, without anger, just stating an observation that she genuinely didn't understand. And that innocence, that pure confusion about why something so fundamentally wrong would happen, made her words more powerful than any sophisticated argument about systemic racism or implicit bias ever could be. Because she was right not to understand it. It didn't make sense. It shouldn't make sense. The fact that a 6-year-old could see the injustice so clearly while adults had normalized it, had looked away from it, had allowed it to happen, that was the real tragedy. Is this what first class is supposed to be? Making people feel small? The question hung in the air, directed at everyone and no one, a challenge to every person in that cabin to examine their own complicity, their own silence, their own failure to notice or care about what was happening in the row behind them or across the aisle from them. First class. The premium experience. The luxury section. The place where people paid thousands of dollars to be treated well, to be comfortable, to be valued. And here was a child asking if the true definition of first class was making people feel small based on the color of their skin. The businessman was the first to move. He closed his laptop with a definitive snap, the sound echoing through the silent cabin like a starting gun. He removed his headphones completely, setting them aside on his tray table, his full attention now on Mimi. His expression had transformed from confusion to understanding to outrage, not at Mimi but at what had been done to her. The elderly woman behind them had tears streaming down her face now, her hand pressed to her mouth as if trying to hold back a sob. Her husband had his arm around her shoulders, but he too looked stricken, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. Another passenger, a man in his 40s sitting 2 rows back, spoke up, his voice cutting through the silence with righteous indignation. "I'd like to see the meals you served her." It wasn't a request. It was a demand. He stood up from his seat and moved into the aisle, and suddenly other passengers were doing the same. The young woman with the phone was recording everything now, making sure to capture Mimi's tray table with its inedible food, then panning to show the remnants of the hot meals other passengers had received. The elderly man stood up and looked at Mimi's tray, then at his own empty plate where his delicious chicken had been. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "Absolutely unacceptable." The businessman leaned across the aisle, examining the sandwich and fruit cup that Mimi had been served. He picked up the sandwich, feeling the hard bread, seeing the wilted lettuce through the plastic. Then he looked at his own tray, at the remnants of his fresh, hot salmon. "This is the same flight. The same ticket class. The same meal service time." He turned to look at Vicker and his voice was ice cold. "Can you explain to me why this child was served expired food while I got a hot meal?" Vicker opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She looked like a fish gasping for air, completely out of her depth, all her authority and confidence evaporated in the face of undeniable evidence and collective witness. The meals, we have different options for," she stammered, but every word that came out just made it worse. "Different options?" The businessman's voice rose slightly. "That's not a different option. That's not even food that should be on this plane. That's garbage you tried to pass off as a meal to a 6-year-old child." The young woman with the phone had moved closer, her video now capturing everything. The food comparison, Vicker's stammering attempts at explanation, the reactions of other passengers. She was narrating quietly into her phone's microphone, providing context for when this video would inevitably be shared. "We are currently on Transatlantic Elite Airways Flight 447. A flight attendant just served a 6-year-old black girl spoiled food while giving hot, fresh meals to every white passenger in first class. When the child politely pointed out that the food was bad, the attendant became hostile. This is what discrimination looks like in real time." Another passenger, a woman in her 30s, had stood up and was examining Mimi's meal as well. She picked up the fruit cup, looking at the brown apples and mushy berries with visible disgust. "This is a health hazard," she said firmly. "This shouldn't be served to anyone, let alone a child on a 7-hour flight." What was she supposed to eat? Vicker's face had gone from red to a sickly gray color. She was looking around the cabin now, realizing that every single passenger in first class was now aware of what she had done, was now witness to her actions, was now unified against her. There was no way to spin this. No way to make it look like anything other than what it was. "I want to speak to the head flight attendant," the businessman said, pulling out his phone. "And I want the captain informed of what's happening in this cabin." "That won't be necessary," Vicker started, but she was immediately cut off by multiple passengers speaking at once. "It's absolutely necessary. Someone needs to be held accountable for this. This is discrimination, plain and simple. That child deserves an apology at minimum." Through all of this, Mimi remained standing on her seat, watching the adults react to what she had said. She wasn't smiling or celebrating. She looked serious, thoughtful, taking in everything that was happening around her. This wasn't about revenge for her. This wasn't about getting someone in trouble. This was about speaking the truth and letting that truth do what truth does: illuminate darkness, expose injustice, demand accountability. Jayla had stood up now, her hands gently touching Mimi's waist, not pulling her down but steadying her, supporting her, silently communicating that she was there, that she was proud, that Mimi had done exactly what she'd been taught to do. "Baby," Jayla said softly, her voice thick with emotion, "you can sit down now. You've said what needed to be said." Mimi looked down at her mother, seeing the tears on Jayla's face, seeing the pride and love and heartbreak all mixed together in her expression. She nodded and carefully sat back down, and immediately Jayla pulled her close, wrapping her arms around her daughter, holding her tight. "I'm so proud of you," Jayla whispered into Mimi's hair. So proud of you." But the cabin wasn't settling down. If anything, the energy was building. More passengers were standing now, moving into the aisle, comparing meals, taking photos of the evidence, discussing what they had witnessed in voices that ranged from shocked to angry to disgusted. The businessman had his phone to his ear, clearly having gotten through to someone. Yes, I'm a passenger in first class, and I need to report a serious incident of discrimination. A flight attendant just served spoiled food to a black child while giving hot meals to white passengers, then became hostile when the child politely complained. Multiple passengers have witnessed this and it's being documented on video. We need someone from management up here immediately. The elderly woman had approached Jayla and Mimi, kneeling in the aisle beside their row. Her face was streaked with tears and when she spoke, her voice was trembling. "Sweetheart, I am so sorry," she said to Mimi. "I am so sorry that happened to you. You are the bravest little girl I have ever seen. What you just did, standing up like that and speaking your truth, that took more courage than most adults have." She turned to Jayla. "Your daughter is remarkable. You should be incredibly proud." "I am," Jayla said, her voice breaking. "I am so proud of her." Other passengers were approaching now, offering similar words of support, of apology for not noticing sooner, of admiration for Mimi's courage. They formed a protective circle around row 2, as if their physical presence could somehow shield this child from any further harm. Vicker had backed away, pressing herself against the galley wall, her expression one of complete panic. She knew her career was over. She knew she was going to be fired. She knew that video was going to go viral, that her face was going to be seen by millions of people, that she would become the face of exactly the kind of discrimination that airlines claimed they didn't tolerate. But more than that, she had been exposed. Not by an angry adult who could be dismissed as making trouble, not by a confrontational passenger who could be accused of seeking attention, but by a 6-year-old child who had simply told the truth with devastating simplicity. The young woman with the phone approached Jayla. "Ma'am, I've been recording what happened. I'm going to post this online because people need to see this. Is that okay with you?" Jayla looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes, please do. Because this happens too often. And if my daughter's courage can help change that, then everyone should see it." The businessman was off the phone now. "The captain is being notified. The head flight attendant is on her way up here. And I've also contacted Transatlantic Elite Airways customer service line. This is going to be addressed, I promise you that." He looked at Mimi directly. "Young lady, what you just did was one of the bravest things I've ever witnessed. You spoke up when many adults wouldn't have. You told the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent. Thank you for that. Thank you for reminding all of us what courage looks like." Mimi looked up at him with those big 6-year-old eyes and said simply, "My mom taught me that my voice matters." "Your mom is absolutely right," the businessman said, his own eyes glistening now. "Your voice matters very much. And I promise you it's going to be heard." The cabin door to the cockpit area opened, and a new flight attendant emerged. This one was older, her uniform bearing the insignia that marked her as the head flight attendant. Her name tag read Nala. Her expression was serious, professional, but also deeply concerned as she took in the scene. The cluster of passengers around row 2, the phone recording everything, Vicker pressed against the wall looking like she wanted to disappear, and at the center of it all, a small child in a purple dress with butterfly clips in her hair. Nala moved through the cabin with purpose, and you could see from her body language that she already knew something serious had happened. Someone had clearly briefed her before she came up here, and she was approaching the situation with the gravity it deserved. She went directly to row 2, and when she spoke, her voice was gentle but also carried unmistakable authority. "Mrs. Jacobs? I'm Nala, the head flight attendant. I've been informed that there's been an incident, and I'm here to address it. Can you tell me what happened?" But before Jayla could speak, the businessman stepped forward. "I can tell you what happened. That flight attendant," he pointed at Vicker, "served this child expired, inedible food while giving hot, fresh meals to every other passenger in first class. When the child politely pointed out that the food was spoiled, the attendant became hostile and dismissive. Then she made comments that made it clear this was racial discrimination. Multiple passengers witnessed it. It's been recorded on video. And we're all prepared to give statements." The elderly man added, "She told them they didn't belong in first class." Said it right out loud. Nala's expression darkened. She looked at Vicker, who seemed to shrink even further against the wall. Then she looked at Mimi's tray table, at the expired food still sitting there as evidence. She picked up the sandwich, examined it, set it down. She looked at the fruit cup, saw the brown apples and mushy berries. She checked the date on the juice box. Her jaw tightened with each item she examined. Then she did something unexpected. She knelt down beside Mimi's seat, bringing herself to the child's eye level so they were face to face. "I need to pause the story here and ask you something critical. How many times have you witnessed something wrong and stayed silent? How many times have you seen someone being treated unfairly and told yourself it wasn't your business? Because what Mimi did, standing up, speaking truth, refusing to be silenced, that's what changes the world. And if this story is touching you, if it's making you think differently about courage and speaking up, then hit that subscribe button right now, because the resolution of this story will restore your faith in justice. Nala looked into Mimi's eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was filled with genuine emotion, genuine regret, genuine respect for this small child who had been so incredibly brave. And what she said next would change everything. Nala knelt there beside Mimi's seat, her eyes level with this brave 6-year-old who had just done what so many adults fail to do: speak truth to power. But before Nala could say anything, before she could address Mimi directly, Vicker finally found her voice again. "This is a misunderstanding," Vicker started, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush, her face cycling through colors like a traffic light, pale white to bright red and back again. "I was just following protocol for children's meals. There are different options and I simply—" "Stop." Nala's voice cut through Vicker's excuses like a blade, sharp and absolute. She didn't even turn around to look at her subordinate. She kept her eyes on Mimi for a moment longer, then slowly stood and turned to face Vicker, and the temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. "What exactly is going on here?" Nala's voice was professional, controlled, but there was an undertone of barely contained fury that everyone in that cabin could hear. This wasn't a casual inquiry. This was the voice of someone who already knew the answer and was giving you one chance, one single chance, to be honest about it. Vicker opened her mouth again, but before she could speak, the passengers did. "I'll tell you what's going on," the businessman said, stepping forward. "That flight attendant served this child spoiled food, food that should have been thrown away, while giving hot, fresh meals to every other passenger. When the child politely complained, she was dismissive and hostile. Then she made it explicitly clear that this was about race. She literally told them they don't belong in first class." The elderly woman spoke up next, her voice still trembling with emotion. "I heard her say it. Some people don't belong in first class." She said it right to their faces. To a mother and her 6-year-old daughter. She questioned their boarding passes even though they were already seated, another passenger added. She didn't question anyone else's tickets. Just theirs. The young woman with the phone held it up. "I have video of the entire confrontation. The expired food, the hostile responses, everything. It's already backed up to the cloud." A man from several rows back stood up. "I want to give a formal statement. I witnessed the entire meal service. The difference in how she treated them versus everyone else was night and day. This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate discrimination." Nala listened to each person speak, her expression growing darker and more serious with each testimony. She looked around the cabin, seeing the unified front of passengers, all of them willing to stand up and speak truth about what they had witnessed. Then she turned back to Vicker. "Is any of this untrue?" Nala asked, her voice deadly quiet. Vicker's mouth opened and closed several times. She looked around the cabin as if searching for an ally, someone who might defend her, but every face she saw was either hostile or disgusted. The protective walls of plausible deniability, of "it's just a misunderstanding," of "you're being too sensitive," all of those defenses had crumbled in the face of collective witness and documented evidence. I was just trying to," Vicker stammered, but even she seemed to realize how pathetic she sounded. There was no explanation that would make this okay. No excuse that would justify what she had done. Nala held up her hand, silencing Vicker's attempts at explanation. Then she turned back to Mimi, and when she knelt down again, her whole demeanor had softened. The professional hardness was still there, but it was tempered now with genuine warmth, genuine remorse, genuine respect. "Sweetheart, can you look at me?" Nala said gently. Mimi, who had been leaning against her mother, turned to face the head flight attendant. Her eyes were still serious, still wary, but also curious. "My name is Nala, and I'm in charge of all the flight attendants on this plane. First, I want to tell you that I am so sorry for what happened to you today. What that flight attendant did was wrong. It was completely unacceptable. And it never should have happened." Mimi nodded slowly, processing this official acknowledgement of the injustice she had experienced. "Second," Nala continued, and her voice filled with genuine admiration, "I want you to know that you were incredibly brave. What you did, standing up and speaking out like that, took enormous courage. And you were right to speak up. You were right to use your voice." She paused, making sure Mimi understood the weight of what she was saying. "You didn't do anything wrong. Not one single thing. The grown-up was wrong. And you were right. Mimi's eyes widened slightly at this validation from an authority figure. An adult in a position of power was telling her that she had been right, that speaking up had been the correct thing to do, that her voice had mattered. Thank you, Mimi said softly, her voice carrying the tiniest hint of relief. Nala smiled at her, a real smile that reached her eyes, then stood and turned to Vicker. The warmth vanished from her expression instantly, replaced by cold professional fury. You're removed from service, effective immediately. Go to the back of the plane and stay there. Don't interact with any passengers. Don't touch any food or beverage service. Just go. Now. Vicker's face drained of all color. But Now. Nala's voice left no room for argument. Another flight attendant, the one who had originally helped Mimi and Jayla during boarding, appeared from the galley. She looked horrified as she took in the scene, understanding immediately what must have transpired. Please escort her to the rear galley and make sure she stays there, Nala said quietly to her colleague. The captain will be informed and will file a full incident report. As Vicker was led away, walking down the aisle past all the passengers she had served, past all the people who had witnessed her actions, the cabin remained absolutely silent. It was the walk of shame in its purest form. Every eye followed her, and every face held the same expression, contempt mixed with satisfaction that justice was being served. When Vicker finally disappeared into the economy section, heading toward the rear of the plane where she would spend the rest of the flight in disgrace, a collective exhale seemed to ripple through first class. Nala turned back to Mimi and Jayla. Now, let me make this right, or at least start to make it right, because I know an apology and a better meal can't undo what happened or how it made you feel. She signaled to another flight attendant. Please bring me our premium meal service. Not the standard first-class meal, the premium service we reserve for special circumstances. The one with the filet mignon. Then she reached over and carefully gathered up the expired sandwich, the brown fruit, the warm juice box, everything that Vicker had served Mimi. She held them all in her hands like they were evidence in a trial, which in a way they were. This will all be documented and included in our incident report. This food should never have been on this plane, let alone served to a passenger. Especially not a child. She looked at Jayla. Mrs. Jacobs, I cannot tell you how ashamed I am that this happened on our airline. This is not who we are. This is not what we stand for. This is not how we train our staff or what we expect from them. And I promise you, this will be addressed at the highest levels of our company. Jayla nodded, her arms still protectively around Mimi's shoulders. I appreciate that. But more than corporate apologies, I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. I want real change, not just damage control. You have my word, Nala said firmly. This incident will be reviewed by our diversity and inclusion team. All of our flight attendants will undergo mandatory retraining. And there will be real consequences, starting with the termination of that individual's employment. The other flight attendant returned from the galley pushing a small cart. On it was a covered plate that, when revealed, looked like something from a five-star restaurant. Perfectly cooked filet mignon with a rich sauce, roasted vegetables arranged artfully, creamy mashed potatoes, a side salad with fresh greens, warm bread in a small basket, and for dessert, a beautiful chocolate mousse cake with fresh berries. Nala personally set up the meal on Mimi's tray table, arranging everything with care, making sure it was perfect. Then she brought out a second identical meal for Jayla. These are on the house, obviously. Along with your entire tickets for this flight, you'll be receiving a full refund. But again, I know that doesn't undo what happened. She looked at Mimi again. Is there anything else I can get for you, sweetheart? Anything at all that would make you more comfortable for the rest of the flight? Mimi looked at the beautiful meal in front of her, then up at Nala. Can I have apple juice? Cold apple juice. Of course you can. Nala smiled. The coldest apple juice we have on this plane coming right up. She returned a moment later with a small bottle of premium apple juice and a glass with ice. She poured it for Mimi, making sure it was perfect, then set the bottle down within reach in case Mimi wanted more. Thank you, Mimi said politely, and Nala's expression softened even further. No, sweetheart. Thank you. Thank you for being brave enough to speak up. Thank you for not letting anyone make you feel small. You taught everyone on this plane, including me, an important lesson today. As Nala moved away to attend to her other duties and to file the incident report, the other passengers began to approach row 2. They came one by one or in pairs, each wanting to speak to Mimi and Jayla, each wanting to express their support and admiration. The businessman came first. He knelt in the aisle beside Mimi's seat, his expensive suit wrinkling as he lowered himself to her level. "Young lady, I want you to know something. I'm 53 years old. I've been in business for 30 years. I've negotiated billion-dollar deals. I've given presentations to thousands of people. And what you did today took more courage than anything I've ever done in my entire career." He paused, his voice becoming thick with emotion. "Your daughter is remarkable," he said to Jayla. "She has more courage than most adults I know. The world needs more people like her, people who speak truth regardless of how uncomfortable it makes others." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, handing it to Jayla. "I'm the CEO of a major corporation. If there's ever anything I can do for your family, college fund, recommendation letter, anything, please don't hesitate to contact me. It would be my honor to help in any way I can." The elderly couple approached next. The woman was still dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, her makeup slightly smeared from crying. "Sweetheart," she said to Mimi, her voice trembling, "I'm 78 years old. I grew up in the South during segregation. I've seen discrimination my whole life, and I'm ashamed to say that sometimes I didn't speak up when I should have. But watching you today, watching you stand up with such grace and courage, it reminded me that it's never too late to do what's right." She took Mimi's small hand in her weathered ones. "Thank you, sweetheart, for reminding us to always do what's right. For showing us that courage doesn't depend on age or size. You're going to change the world, I just know it." Her husband nodded in agreement. "Your parents raised you right, young lady. Never lose that voice. Never let anyone silence you." The young woman with the phone approached next, and she was smiling through tears of her own. "I posted this," she said, holding up her phone to show Jayla. "The video I took, I posted it to Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, everywhere. And it's already going viral. In the 30 minutes since I posted it, it's been shared thousands of times. Tens of thousands of people have already seen it." She showed them her phone screen, and even in that short time the view count was climbing rapidly. Comments were pouring in, messages of support for Mimi, outrage at Vicker's behavior, demands for accountability from Transatlantic Elite Airways. "The world needs to see this," the young woman continued. "People need to understand that this still happens. That discrimination isn't some historical thing, it's happening right now, every day to real people. And they need to see what courage looks like. What speaking truth to power looks like. Your daughter is a hero." Other passengers continued to approach. A middle-aged woman brought Mimi a stuffed teddy bear from the airline's gift collection. "You're the bravest little girl I've ever met," she said simply. A man in his 20s who had been sitting near the back of first class, brought up a children's activity kit. "My little sister is about your age," he said to Mimi. "When I tell her this story she's going to think you're the coolest person in the world. Because you are." Another passenger, a woman in her 40s, approached Jayla directly. "I'm an attorney who specializes in civil rights cases. If you decide to pursue legal action against the airline, I would be honored to represent you pro bono. What happened here today was textbook discrimination, and you have dozens of witnesses and video evidence." She handed Jayla her card. "Think about it. Not just for yourselves but for everyone else who might experience this in the future. Real change sometimes requires legal pressure." Through all of this, Mimi sat quietly eating her beautiful meal, which actually tasted as good as it looked, and taking in all the attention, all the praise, all the support. She wasn't preening or showing off. She seemed almost thoughtful, processing everything that had happened and everything people were saying to her. Jayla watched her daughter, this incredible child who had shown more courage in 10 minutes than many people show in a lifetime, and felt her heart swell with pride so intense it was almost painful. When the stream of passengers finally slowed, when things began to settle back into some semblance of normalcy, Jayla set down her own fork and turned to Mimi. She wrapped both arms around her daughter and pulled her close, burying her face in Mimi's natural curls, breathing in the scent of her, feeling the warmth and solidity of her child in her arms. "I am so proud of you, baby," Jayla whispered, her voice breaking. So proud of you. You didn't let anyone make you feel small. You used your voice. You stood up for yourself. You showed everyone in this cabin what true courage looks like." Mimi pulled back slightly so she could look up at her mother's face. Her own expression was serious, thoughtful. "My voice mattered, didn't it, Mama?" she asked, and there was something in her tone, a kind of wonder, a realization of her own power, her own worth, her own ability to create change in the world. Jayla cupped Mimi's face in her hands, looking directly into those bright, intelligent eyes. "Your voice will always matter, baby. Always. Don't you ever forget that. Don't let anyone ever make you believe otherwise. Your voice matters because you matter. Because you're important. Because you deserve to be heard and respected and treated with dignity. She kissed Mimi's forehead. What you did today, you changed things. You changed how these people think about discrimination. You changed how they'll respond when they see injustice. You changed what happens to that flight attendant. You changed the policies this airline will have to implement. One voice, your voice, created ripples that will spread farther than you can imagine. Mimi absorbed this, processing it in that intense way children do when they're learning something fundamental about themselves and the world. I was scared, she admitted quietly. I know you were, baby. That's what made it brave. Courage isn't not being scared. Courage is being scared and doing the right thing anyway. Like Amelia Earhart? Jayla smiled through her tears. Exactly like Amelia Earhart. You flew today, baby. Maybe not a plane, but you soared. You soared so high. The rest of the flight passed in a completely different atmosphere than it had begun. Nala checked on them regularly, making sure they had everything they needed. Other passengers continued to come by, offering words of support, taking photos with Mimi with Jayla's permission, sharing their own stories of discrimination they had witnessed or experienced. The young woman with the phone kept updating them on the video's progress. Within 2 hours, it had been viewed over 1 million times. News outlets were picking it up. Civil rights organizations were sharing it. Hashtag Mimi Jacobs was trending on Twitter. Transatlantic Elite Airways social media accounts were being flooded with comments demanding accountability. By the time the plane began its descent into Paris, the story had gone global. Mimi Jacobs, 6 years old, wearing a purple dress with butterfly clips, had become the face of a movement, a symbol of courage, a reminder that change happens when people refuse to stay silent. The landing was smooth. As passengers gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark, many of them stopped by row 2 one last time to say goodbye to Mimi and Jayla. Some hugged them. Some shook their hands. Some simply smiled and nodded, that understanding passing between them that they had all been part of something important, something that would be remembered. As they walked through the jetway and into Charles de Gaulle Airport, Jayla held Mimi's hand tightly. Her phone was already buzzing with notifications. News requests, interview requests, messages from friends who had seen the video, emails from civil rights organizations offering support. But none of that mattered in that moment. What mattered was the feel of her daughter's small hand in hers. What mattered was knowing that Mimi had learned the most important lesson anyone can learn, that her voice matters, that speaking truth is powerful, that one person really can make a difference. 3 hours into a transatlantic flight, a 6-year-old girl taught an entire cabin full of adults what courage really means. She didn't shout. She didn't curse. She didn't throw a tantrum or make threats or demand to speak to managers. She simply stood up and told the truth. She stated facts with devastating simplicity. She asked questions that exposed injustice. She refused to accept being made to feel small. And sometimes that's the most powerful thing you can do. See, we live in a world that tells us to stay quiet, to not make waves, to accept less than we deserve because speaking up is uncomfortable, because confrontation is awkward, because we don't want to be seen as difficult or demanding or playing some kind of card. But Mimi Jacobs showed us something different. She showed us that dignity isn't about age or size or the color of your skin. It's about knowing your worth and refusing to accept anything less. It's about understanding that your voice matters, not because of who you are or what you look like, but simply because you're a human being deserving of respect. The video of Mimi's speech went viral, viewed over 50 million times in the first week. Transatlantic Elite Airways issued a public apology within 24 hours. They announced a comprehensive review of their training procedures, their diversity and inclusion policies, and their complaint handling processes. They committed to mandatory anti-bias training for all employees. They established a passenger advocacy hotline specifically for discrimination complaints. Vicker was terminated, her employment ended before the plane even landed in Paris. The airline made it clear that her actions did not reflect their values or their standards, and that they had zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind. But more than the corporate response, more than the policy changes, more than the termination of one bad actor, Mimi started a conversation that needed to happen. Her story was shared in schools, used as a teaching tool about courage and speaking up. Civil rights organizations highlighted it as an example of how discrimination persists and why we all need to be vigilant. Parents showed the video to their children, using it to teach lessons about dignity and self-worth. Airlines across the industry reviewed their own policies, not wanting to become the next viral discrimination story. Mimi Jacobs became a name that people knew, a child who had done something remarkable, who had changed hearts and minds simply by refusing to be silenced. But if you asked Mimi about it, and many reporters did, she would just shrug in that way 6-year-olds do and say, "My mom told me my voice matters. I was just using it." As if it were that simple. As if courage were that easy. As if standing up to discrimination and speaking truth to power were just natural things that anyone would do. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Maybe it should be that simple. Maybe it should be that easy. Maybe if more of us had the courage of a 6-year-old child, if more of us refused to stay silent in the face of injustice, if more of us used our voices the way Mimi used hers, maybe the world would be a fundamentally different place. Never underestimate the power of a child who refuses to be silenced. Never underestimate the impact of one voice speaking truth. Never underestimate the ripples that spread when someone stands up and says, "This is wrong and I deserve better." Because on Flight 447 to Paris, Mimi Jacobs proved that change doesn't always come from the powerful or the famous or the adults in the room. Sometimes it comes from a 6-year-old in a purple dress with butterfly clips in her hair, standing on an airplane seat, teaching everyone around her what courage really looks like. And the world is better for it. Now I want to ask you something important. After hearing Mimi's story, what will you do the next time you witness injustice? Will you stay silent or will you use your voice? Because that's the real question Mimi challenges us with, not whether discrimination exists, but whether we have the courage to speak up when we see it. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, if it inspired you, if it made you think differently about courage and speaking up, subscribe to this channel right now. Because stories like this, stories that remind us of our power to create change, stories that show us what real bravery looks like, these are the stories that need to be told and shared and remembered. Mimi Jacobs will always be 6 years old in that viral video, standing on her seat, speaking her truth. But the impact of what she did, the conversation she started, the courage she inspired, that will last forever. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you're faced with injustice, the next time you see someone being treated unfairly, the next time you have a choice between staying silent or speaking up, you'll remember a little girl in a purple dress who showed us all what it means to use your voice. Because your voice matters too. And the world is waiting to hear it.